Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM or streaming live from ksfr.org. I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy, and I'm speaking with Dan Pritchard today. He's a member of the Executive Committee of Renewable Taos and a longtime climate activist. We'll get to Dan after just a few short announcements. First, last week, I spoke with State Senator Liz Stefanik. We discussed the 2022 legislative session, the legislative process itself, and her views on effective advocacy. Senator Stefanik has served in the state Senate for 3 terms now, so she actually really does know what she speaks. The week before that, I spoke with Roxanne Barber, the other co-founder of Retake Our Democracy, and the person who manages our advocacy at the Roundhouse, from finalizing our bill summaries to tirelessly operating our alert system. Over a period of 3 weeks, we used 3 shows to break down the legislative process at its midpoint, with 1 week to go, and immediately after the session ended. It's a good way to see how our view anyway of how the process worked or didn't work and how bills progressed or didn't progress. I want to remind you that if you're driving around and miss any of today's show, you can watch the full YouTube recording by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on Retake on the Radio. That's a big blue button on the right side of the homepage, so you can't miss it. And when you click on that page, you'll find all of our past shows right there to watch, along with this one. So you can go there to do that. Let's move right along. I also want to acknowledge that this show is being recorded on stolen Tewa land, and we want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. We could learn a lot from them and need to pretty quickly. I also want to remind you that even though the 2022 legislative session is over, Retake is not quite done. We're hosting a kind of a debrief on the whole session on March 9th. That's a Wednesday from 6 to 7:30. And we'll be examining the legislative process itself and how it could be changed and how we can improve our advocacy to achieve even better results. So you won't want to miss that. And now that the legislative process is done, we'll also be shifting our focus, turning to the looming primaries and general elections. And we'll kick that off with a candidate forum with Joe Maestas and Zach Quintero, 2 excellent Democratic candidates for state auditor. I must admit, I had only a vague understanding of the role of auditor until I had a conversation with Zach Quintero about his goals for running for auditor, and then in a separate conversation with the current auditor and candidate for Attorney General, Brian Colon. The auditor has the authority to hold any state, county, or city government accountable for failing to fulfill their purpose or for corrupting their function. So this is a very important position, or they can do nothing. They can, so that it can go both ways. So this is an important position with the potential for having a real ally out there to seek justice in New Mexico. That forum, we're not calling it a debate because the candidates aren't running against each other, they're running for a position. And that forum will be on March 17th from 6:30 to 8 p.m. and it should be a very compelling discussion. You must register to participate in either of these Zooms. To find a link, go to retakeourdemocracy.org, click on the events and actions page, and right there at the top, you'll see both of these events described with links to register, and you need to register to participate. That's enough announcements, I think. Let's get started. Welcome, Dan. Thanks for making time for this conversation. So let's kick it off. How about, I always let guests introduce themselves. So how about you take a minute to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in climate activism generally and specifically with Renewable Taos. Take it away, Dan.
Hello, Paul, all of our listeners, happy to be here. I live in Taos, having moved here in 2015 from Albuquerque, where I had a 35-year career at a national laboratory as an electrical engineer and project manager. Starting there in 1976, I worked to evaluate and write research papers on evaluating solar cells for electricity generation, also known as photovoltaic cells. You see these now in large panels and huge arrays producing hundreds of megawatts of electric power. Back then, we would test individual cells under development. After retiring and moving to Taos, my partner Christy and I founded Taos United as an outlet for all the angst built up within the community as a result of the Trump election. After a few years, I joined the board of Renewable Taos, a nonprofit here focusing on local energy, strong economy, and a resilient community. I think all that underpins the issue of environmental justice.
Okay, I think you're right. So we were talking a little bit before we started the interview about how you had an election up there in Taos, and I guess it went pretty well. Do you want to tell us about it? Because we could always use good news.
Yes, yesterday we had an election for the town mayor, 2 out of the 4 town councilors, and other assorted elections around Taos County. There were 4 candidates for mayor and 4 candidates for the 2 town council seats, and I think my favorite candidates all persevered and ran a great election, and they got elected. We have a new mayor now.
Isn't the new mayor like 25 years old?
I think he's closer to 30, but or early 30s, but he's got a great education, great history, has been on the town council for the last several years. So he knows the ins and outs, and he knows how to move forward in that position. And we've got a young woman on the town council now, who's also very energetic and knowledgeable and a great contributor to the community. And an older, more seasoned new town councilor who's been involved in in the town budgeting process for many, many years. So she'll be a great resource to the new mayor.
Well, that sounds great. And it's good to see some fresh young blood ascend into a position of responsibility in Taos. Can you tell us just a little bit more about Renewable Taos and how it works to achieve the vision you described?
Yeah, Renewable Taos is a loose-knit organization of very interested, knowledgeable, and capable individuals. It was formed in 2012, and those founders focused on supporting the local electric cooperative, Kit Carson Electric, and initiating the buyout and exit from Tri-State Generation and Transmission Cooperative. Tri-State limited the co-op to only 5% of local solar generation, and that was ridiculous. So Kit Carson ended up being the first cooperative to exit Tri-State and is now very close to operating local solar arrays that will provide 100% peak summer daytime renewable solar electricity, and that's just great. The economics of that transition was heavily promoted by Renewable Taos, so I think we had a very influential impact on the local utility. We still work with them on many other things. I'll say a little bit more about Renewable Taos. Our strategic plan has 10 major objectives that I'm not going to go into detail, but focus on 100% beneficial electrification for homes and businesses, promoting electric transportation, which is a source of about half of all of our carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions in Taos County. We focus on increasing electric storage, and we promote electricity transmission here in northern New Mexico. Along with all that goes the education of citizens, helping local government with progressive plans and policies, and conducting legislative outreach. One of the other things we've done recently is we sponsor an annual electric vehicle expo where we invite EV owners to exhibit and interact with locals to educate them about electric transportation. We include a speaker program that's very popular, and we've also purchased and installed some chargers around town.
Yeah, I saw one of those over by the park, Kit Carson Park, right? In the parking lot there.
That's correct.
Okay. So I saw you on Zoom offering public comment a number of times during the legislative session. I'm wondering what you thought, how you thought we did. Did we get enough done?
Well, I saw progress in educating our lawmakers on hydrogen, for example, but little progress elsewhere. It seems most of the environmental organizations point to one bill that made it through, the Community Energy Efficiency Development Block Grant, HB 37, that was sponsored by our local representative here, Christina Ortez. That bill helps municipalities by allowing them to apply for grants to improve energy efficiency, particularly for low-income households. It's been years in the making, but it still had a third of legislators voting against it. Surprisingly, it was just signed by the governor. I think progressive advocates certainly tried. There were many good bills.
Yeah, it seems among our bills, we had EV, electric vehicle tax credit, storage tax credit, and solar development tax credits. All of those barely got out of committee, if they did get out of their first committee. It was very disheartening. And it's actually something we need to take a look at for a retake, in that we got so absorbed with fighting the hydrogen hub that we weren't paying enough attention to bills that were, and bills that were coming into a hearing. We weren't tracking as well as we should have how many of our bills were just sitting in their first committee and not going anywhere. And by the time they got going, it was too late to go anywhere. From your perspective, what was the single greatest accomplishment of the session?
I look at the concerted efforts to educate the notion of how methane produced hydrogen is really just another gas and oil project. There was really good interaction amongst the environmental organizations and legislators, enough to cause the slowdown and defeat of the so-called hydrogen hub legislation. It seems to me that this defeat may be short-lived, but at least we got the attention of folks, and it was a stop and think moment.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's kind of disheartening to get that done and then see the governor sign off on an agreement with 3 other states to develop bids to try and get some of that $8 billion in infrastructure money.
I think this education is something we can build on. Economically and environmentally, hydrogen from methane, also called natural gas, makes very little sense. But as you know, we have stiff opposition from those who want those billions of dollars in grants from the feds to do this. So,
right. Well, we're going to get to talking about how we forge the kind of coalition we're going to need to actually move the needle significantly in a little bit. But for right now, so what was your biggest disappointment in the session?
Well, the perpetual disappointment is the near insanity of a 30-day session. This is no way to run a government. A 30-day session is horribly inefficient on everyone's time. So much effort put into good legislation and so little time to present, educate, comment on, debate, refine, vote on. Not to mention all the tactics used to delay and subvert and table and defeat. Some of them are just memorials, just let's do a study, and you couldn't even get those put through committee.
Right. I agree with you. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about in our huddle is like just the legislative process itself. It's not that much better in a 60-day session. It's just excruciatingly longer in some ways. And so
yeah, I'm always looking for other ways to make progress, and working with our local electric cooperative is one of those ways.
Right. Well, looking into the future, I know you're part of a team organizing the advocacy for creating public power in New Mexico. What is public power and how could New Mexico benefit?
Well, public power refers to publicly owned utilities, of which there are thousands in the United States. The other models are rural electric cooperatives, such as Kit Carson Electric, and investor-owned utilities. Investor-owned utilities are basically privately owned regulated monopolies where those investors are guaranteed, a return on investment of 7 to 10%. That's very favorable to investors, but a penalty to the customers, or often called the ratepayers.
Mhm.
So simply, if the large investor-owned utilities in New Mexico were taken public, that 7 to 10% profit could be used to increase wages and benefits, reduce the rates to low-income customers, build more renewable generation, add electricity storage, and ultimately keep fossil resources in the ground for future generations instead of burning them for carbon and heat. And that would help us mitigate this climate crisis.
So I need to take a quick break here to remind our listeners that KSFR is more important than ever right now in this age of misinformation and disinformation. You get the straight scoop from KSFR. And if you like getting the straight scoop, and Amy Goodman at 4 and at 6 in the morning, 4 in the afternoon, 3 in the afternoon, I'm sorry. Shows like Retake Our Democracy and Richard Wolff on capitalism at 8 on Saturday mornings. How about if you, after you finish listening to this show, go to ksfr.org, click on the donate button, give them 10 or 20 bucks and view it as your ticket to admission for real information. So with that, we'll move back to our conversation with Dan Pritchard, from the executive board of Renewable Taos. You started to talk about what public power is, and Renewable Taos and Retake Our Democracy were part of a coalition of 8 organizations that were trying to get public power memorial to study public power through the legislature. And it was assigned to the House Labor, Veterans, and Military Affairs Committee, which seemed like an odd assignment until you remember that both the Senator Worth and Speaker Egoff were informed very strongly that labor was opposed to this effort. And so they assigned it, the speaker assigned it to House Labor, and it was never even called for a committee hearing. So we got nowhere with it. In a second effort, what do advocates and legislative sponsors need to do differently to advance this important legislation? And how do we address labor opposition?
Well, it's not clear to me why labor opposed this. I need to hear why. Certainly, some of that profit now going to investors could be used to increase wages and benefits. Energy, especially renewable energy, is a critical infrastructure, just as important as educating our children, and those in this career field should receive appropriate pay. To put it a little differently, if we ruin our world with continued greenhouse gas emissions, nothing else matters. So we need to take public control of our energy resources and save the planet. There's smart people out there, not corporate entities, and these people know how to do this. If you look at other models like the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, they have 1.4 million electricity customers. It's a public utility. They know how to do it, and they do it right.
And we could do it here. Yeah,
we could do it here.
Well, let's shift gears for a second. I want to take a look at the global environmental situation, just to not exactly cheer ourselves up. The IPCC just released yet another bleak report, and that's coming on the heels of the last bleak report. And none of these things seem to be moving the needle very far or motivating people to actually make the kinds of changes that need to be made. Have you taken a look at the report or anything that summarizes it? And do you have any comments on that?
Well, it's always a tremendous amount of work that they put into these reports. I'm looking at the report now. I just fear that most people are too wrapped up in their daily lives to think too much about these reports, unfortunately.
Mhm.
Here in Taos, though, we do have a lot of people who are interested, and that is inspiring to me. We need to do everything we can to stop burning fossil resources for heat. If we destroy the planet, nothing else really matters, does it? Um, I don't rely on these reports. I'm convinced. We're working locally, but thinking globally, as the saying goes. And with local successes, these often make regional and national press, and that helps inspire people. Kit Carson Electric, for example, has fame and notoriety as in their progress as a local rural electric cooperative that is approaching 100% solar energy. That's just daytime. It doesn't include nighttime, but it's the first step, and it's good press, and people look to these successes for inspiration.
Yeah. What is the next steps in terms of getting to where you've got 100% renewables in the evening as well?
Adding storage. Kit Carson has a 15 megawatt solar array going in right now at the airport. It'll be producing electricity within the next 30 or 45 days. In conjunction with that, they are also installing 10 huge Tesla batteries, providing them with, I believe it's 24 megawatt hours of energy storage. So that allows them to, for example, pull out of battery storage a load of 12 megawatts for 2 hours. It doesn't sound like much, but it's a start. And I think we're one of the first co-ops in the nation to be installing battery storage on that scale for our customers here, for their
Well, that's
customers here,
that's
all the
really
members.
important to hear these successes.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's the
on our
first
trip,
step, and we'll make some more of those first steps too. Yep.
okay. So I wanted to just mention, and this is a long intro to a very, very specific question. On our trip back from Arizona, Roxanne and I listened to Juno Diaz, a speaker in a podcast of his, and he was speaking about the power of radical hope. And he was speaking. This recording was made like the week after Trump was elected. He described his coming from the Caribbean with an ancestry that was enslaved, and that given where Caribbean Blacks are now and where they were 250 years ago, how could he not be hopeful that we could marshal the resources and the will to overcome Trump? And then by extension, he went on to talk about climate change in the same way. He noted that he had no faith in any of our leaders, economic, cultural, or political, or in their ability or their interest in making the kind of change that is needed. And certainly there's been evidence of that, and that is required, and that the kind of change that is required would only come from the bottom up, with impacted communities of all colors recognizing the common enemy and forging strategies to disarm the capitalist neoliberal powers that stand in the way of just, sustainable world. While I can see his point and be inspired by it, I also remember being blown away and uplifted by Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, and thinking to myself, maybe she's right. Her this that would change everything was the intersection of climate advocacy and indigenous justice, and justice for all impacted communities. And her perspective was that you can't address climate change without changing the systems of neoliberalism and capitalism and colonialism. And I think she's fundamentally correct in that analysis. She wrote the book almost a decade ago, though, and the most recent IPCC report offers no evidence of a retreat from neoliberalism and no evidence of a movement erupting from the bottom up. Indeed, it is the new neoliberals who are writing these reports and creating the climate strategies like net zero that allow us to fiddle while Rome burns. And so my question is, that's a long-winded intro to my question. If the movement that is needed must come from beneath and be led by those from impacted communities, what does that look like in New Mexico? And what can relatively privileged older white folks like us do to help ignite support and accelerate the growth of such a movement?
Well, I think it goes without saying to get involved, and this can be anything from uh, working with local organizations to increase energy efficiency of residences, thus establishing case studies that can be used for other grants. Say, here's what we did, here's the success that we made, let's do more of this. And early adopters are so important to building the market, like electric transportation, whether it's electric bicycles or cars or pickup trucks, which, by the way, most people are waiting for with bated breath for an electric pickup. But we want it. It's coming, perhaps not soon enough. EVs are a lot more expensive than your basic used car lot transportation, but look at color TVs. Those were pretty expensive when they were introduced 60 years ago or so.
Mhm.
But as more people wanted them, the costs came down. And I think there's going to be a huge shift in the next 2 or 3 years to electric vehicles. Remember, this is about 30% of our national carbon generation, burning fossil fuels just to move us from point A to point B.
Mhm, mhm. So you're optimistic in that respect that we're going to start seeing more progress in this transition?
Yeah, I mean, the feds are putting in a lot of money into EV charging stations. It's not clear what that's going to look like in the end. Who's going to be buying the electricity? How they're going to be charging for charge? What's the rate structure? The cost for charging your car? It's clearly a lot less expensive than buying gasoline, though.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and as the prices come down, if you can get some tax credits into the legislation through the legislature, then it can be a more affordable for lower income people. So one of the things you and I spoke about before is that, if the movement in New Mexico is going to be from the bottom up, and the impacted communities, certainly that includes indigenous people, but I think it also includes rural people. And increasingly, no matter what session you're talking about, there is this rural urban divide, with rural folks supporting development no matter what, and almost always involving gas and oil. And the most recent manifestation was the hydrogen hub. And yet there doesn't seem to be any sense of a alliance between rural and urban New Mexico about other ways to address the need for some kind of development and jobs and revenue in rural New Mexico. And that's where public power could come in. But the all the air was sucked out of the room with the hydrogen hub. We're about out of time, Dan. We're going to continue this conversation in just a minute. Can you just tell people real quickly how they can find out more about Renewable Taos?
Sure. We are online at renewabletaos.org, and we meet every Monday at 2:30 on Zoom. We will be having evening sessions as well, starting this month or next month. And we encourage people just to tune in and listen, and eventually, hopefully, figure out where they might want to help contribute with our mission. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank Dan for being with us, and you can listen to the rest of our conversation at retakeourdemocracy.org, Retake on the Radio. We'll be back next week. Not sure who the guest will be, but we'll be back next Saturday at 8:30. Talk to you then. Bye-bye. By the miracle of podcast, I'm back with Dan Pritchard, and we're about to discuss the million-dollar question of how do we find a common ground between rural New Mexico and the Republicans and Democrats and urban New Mexico. And one of the things that can kind of underscore how difficult this could be is just the degree to which we are utterly unable to unify around addressing COVID. That's an existential threat to our communities and to our older people. And yet, when the governor of the state tries to take proactive action to insist on masks, to social distancing, and encouraging people to get their vaccinations, and not allowing indoor anything, whether it's restaurants or meetings. You get this knee-jerk response of like, she's just a fascist who's trying to, they're trying to tell us how to live our lives, and we have our own way of living, and you can't tell us what to do. And that was brought home to me when we went to a restaurant in Gallup on our way back from Arizona. And it's a good, healthy restaurant there called Camille's. And one of the first comments, on the Yelp was, "It's a great place. Too bad the democratically controlled government is trying to destroy the industry." And it's like, that's exactly what the Democrats are trying to do, is destroy the restaurant industry. That's their goal. And yet, you see this on a national level, you see it on a local level. There's this absolute mistrust and inability to connect with common good. Like, what are we going to do for each other for whatever? And if we can't do it around COVID, how optimistic can you be around something like climate change? And because it's a similar thing, we've got to make some sacrifices for the benefit of everyone. And we all need to do that. Do you have any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Well, I get inspiration from seeing the ability of everyone to do something, whether it's plastic bags, a ban on plastic bags, or here in Taos, we are working on several fronts, from something what seems simple like recycling, through smart utility rate setting for homeowner battery storage. That feeds into resiliency, which feeds into sustainability. So rural areas could use battery storage too. They don't have to have solar panels. The threat of wildfires. We have major transmission lines going through the state in all directions. Many of those are from wooden poles, which are extremely vulnerable to wildfires here through town. And if individual residences had the ability, or through tax credits or other kind of rebates, to put in distributed electrical storage batteries, that helps the co-op, that helps the sustainability of the region, and it helps us keep those fossil resources in the ground for future generations instead of burning them for heat.
So it sounds to me like you see the cup as half full, where I'm looking at it half empty. How do we unify rural communities to embrace some of what you're talking about? Is the public power initiative, does that have the potential to generate the kinds of jobs and revenue that Representative Lundstrom was talking about from hydrogen hubs?
Well, public power, I think, is more geared toward municipalities as opposed to rural electric co-ops. The rural electric co-ops are pretty well set up to do largely what they want to do. But it is a matter of education, and we are doing outreach to other co-ops in the area as well, such as Jemez Mountains Electric Co-op and Plains Electric, to show them what we're doing here in the Kit Carson service area for solar generation, and looking forward to some rate design where it is feasible for people to have battery storage, which contributes to the resiliency and sustainability of the electricity for all of our neighbors.
Well, the one thing that occurs to me is, if people are really interested in the quality of life of rural New Mexicans, if they're able to reduce their energy costs by 50%, that would put some money in their pockets. That money would be spent on local goods and services, and not on P&M, where it goes out of state, those profits. And so that could be part of that education campaign. But I feel like it's ultimately, and I thought this after the last session, is that at some point we have to find a way to identify common ground with people who have this knee-jerk response to anything quote unquote liberal or coming from the legislature. I mean, it was like Patty Lundstrom on the floor of the House was talking about, we're not going to let Santa Fe tell us what to do. We're going to develop our own damn hydrogen hub. And it's like, well, Santa Fe, it's not like it's the city of Santa Fe, it's the legislature that meets in the state capitol. But I think her point was both kind of merging Santa Fe as liberal, a hub, a liberal hub instead of a hydrogen hub, and that they weren't going to listen to those liberals. And at some point, it just seems if we're ever going to make any progress on any of these pressing issues, we need to come together and try and solve them in a more collegial way, rather than, you know, like the first time something you see, you surface something, their instinct is to go, okay, what's wrong with that? And why won't it work? Instead of let's work together on this. And
Yeah, I think that there's some serious case studies to be made, specifically with that Escalante power plant. If you look at the economics of that, you know, they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to convert it over to hydrogen, and they have to have oxygen extractors and, you know, methane reformers to get to hydrogen, and it's an extremely complicated process, and there's still carbon generation. If you look at the economics, putting a huge fields of, and they have the space of solar panels and battery storage would get them where they want to be without carbon generation and greenhouse gas byproducts, and they'd still have $100 million left over to generate some good paying jobs out there in complementary fields. It's all about economics, and if they could see that and stop listening to, let's say, the oil and gas lobby, who is looking for a way to use that methane that they're pumping out of the ground in vast quantities, maybe they'd see the benefit.
well, and it's like, why are they trusting the gas and oil industry more than their elected officials? You know, it's how many times do you have to be lied to before you start to add it up? I don't know. But you know, from what I recall from the Energy Transition Act bill when it was being passed, you know, the gas and oil industry had people lined up, and P&M had people lined up to speak, and it was all about how we can preserve jobs or how we can take care of displaced workers, and that's what this bill will do for us, overlooking all the things that it didn't do, and also overlooking ways in which that could have been done in another way, without having to give a big handout to San Juan and P&M. Well, so that's our work. We got to try and engage and educate. That's Retake's mission, and it's also sounds like it's Renewable Taos. So we'll have to work together on some of these things. And I know we'll be working together on the Public Power Initiative, which I think has the potential to be that kind of economic driver that at some point could get the attention of, you know, rural New Mexico and go, okay, well, hydrogen hub, that's something we want, but we could also do this. But that's for another day then, Dan. Thank you very much for being with me today. And you can tell our folks who are still hanging with us, once again, how they can get more information about Renewable Taos.
Sure, my pleasure, Paul. Glad to be here. renewabletaos.org. We meet every Monday on Zoom to talk about projects and activities here in northern New Mexico.
Okay, well, say hi to Christy for me, and we'll see you the next time we're up in Taos, or when you're down here. Take
Okay,
care.
thanks.
Goodbye, listeners. We'll be back next week. And I'm not sure who's going to be our guest next week. I'm trying to get Brian Egolf, but he's been very difficult to garner or to engage. And the week following, though, I know we're going to have Rena Sapansky, who is running to take his seat. She's his former chief of staff and also the former president of Emerge, and also a very smart woman of color. And so someone who Retake will undoubtedly be supporting. So that's it for today. We'll be back next week. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay engaged. It's the only way we fix this mess. Bye-bye.